I'm Joanna Santa Barbara, co-chair of the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, and welcome you to this presentation. And I would like to just frame it. The presenters, to whom I'll introduce you in a little more detail in a moment, are making a strong, hopeful, assertive statement that a clean energy future is possible, strongly aware, our speakers are, of the relentless increase in heating of the earth, and also the fact that we're still a predominantly fossil-fueled economy, despite the fast growth of renewable energy. And they are asking, and will seek to answer the question, can we transition to alternative systems in time? And we'll proceed to examine this question through their eyes and through our own comments. And when we get to the question and answer time, because we are a highly select small audience, we don't have to resort to any formalities. We can just either put up your hand like that or use the little hand up icon, and I hope that I shall spot you. So let me present the speakers to you. They both have long, varied, and extremely interesting lives, and I've extracted just a few things to tell you about. Jace is the granddaddy of the e-bike business in New Zealand, and yay for Jace on that account. He's a consultant for Next Gen Energy, which is a not-for-profit power company. He's been a vocal advocate of the transition to electric transport for 13 years. Jace is a strong supporter of Nelson Tasman Climate Forum and has been from the beginning, plays an active role with the leadership group. But cerebral activity is not the only forte of Jace. He's also a legendary beach volleyball player. He's impresario for wonderful productions such as Awestruck by Nature, Messages from the Matriarchs, and last night, My Love Affair with Nature. And he is also a musician of note. I've heard Jace on guitar, and he's a beautiful musician. And now passing to John. So I'll mention first of all that John is also a fine musician, in particular at this point in his life a chorister, and last count he was a member of four choirs simultaneously.
A couple of those I play bass on instead of singing.
Oh, is that right? Okay, terrific. John's family moved from England to Africa when he was 3, and he was eventually in South Africa, where John and his wife Anthea became involved in the racial protests. John wrote and produced an anti-apartheid musical. This made life more uncomfortable in South Africa, and he moved to the US, where he invented inkjet printers.
One of the inventors.
A team of inventors led the team of inventors. In a different facet of his life, he has been involved for a very long time in the Alternatives to Violence project, which led to peace work in Nepal over many years, and also to his being president of the Alternatives to Violence Project International for 6 years, and working on Friends peace teams, that is, projects from the Quakers. John and Anthea came to Aotearoa 4.5 years ago, and John has been quite involved in the work of the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, in particular the Climate Justice Group, and has continued climate work with the Quakers. So to these two musical intellectuals and practical activists, I will now pass the baton to listen to your hopeful message.
That's quite something to live up to. Let's see what we can do.
I'm looking forward to these people, with the way they sound. They sound quite impressive to me.
So there is a clean energy future is a statement. We'll find out later on whether it's a true statement or not. I'm going to pass to Jace, because we've mixed in slides that he and I have made, and this one is one of his, so I'm going to let him speak to it.
Yeah, a lot of these slides that I've put in here are ones from a talk that I've given around New Zealand dozens of times, called Your Future is Electric, and which I have sort of talked about the transportation and convenience features of New Zealand transitioning to electric power, and that would win out over all the other things that were considered. There was, people who were advocating hydrogen and other things, and these, my take was that in terms of bikes and cars and home heating and things like that, eventually we would transition to electric usage. And so we were blessed with the kind of resources to do that. And so John and I had been talking about maybe doing this primer about educating people to the energy issue, because we think that there are some misnomers that are going around, and that there's basic misunderstandings of the challenge we have to the transition. So that's why is that fair to say?
Yes.
Start? So we're going to go down through some slides, and they'll be a little bit more engaging than this one. The first one, we're just going to make it sort of a bullet points thing. So the sources of energy, they're numerous. Some are cleaner than others. The chemical sources, which we mean petrochemicals, are the most polluting. Electrical usage is the cleanest. Some sources are quite a bit more expensive than other sources, and those make a big difference in the marketplace. Interestingly, the least cost generators of electricity currently are wind and solar in most locations of the world. And we make the posit, we want to bring this up, that clean electrical energy can replace nearly all other forms of generation over time, and that we need to do this. And that's our question. And you guys can, if you have questions upon each slide, go ahead and pipe up, but otherwise we'll just shift on to slides.
So there are just 3 definitions that I want to cover here to keep it. And the first one is, what is energy? And both a technical and a practical definition of energy is the capacity to do work. And carbon dioxide from energy generation is only 70% of the problem in the atmosphere. Methane is a distant but significant second. And you see that 90% of our excess carbon dioxide comes from burning fossil fuels. So here are the other 2 definitions. Where for this presentation, we're defining fossil energy, a generation, that any generation that produces carbon dioxide. And I'm talking about carbon dioxide in its normal operation. We'll cover later the fact that you can use carbon dioxide in the creation of some of these.
Maybe think burning in that regard.
Yes, think burning.
Think, think burning.
I've used the word cool energy here instead of clean energy. They're almost interchangeable. The reason I used cool throughout this presentation is to recognize that there are some unclean generation methods such as nuclear fission, but they're still cool in this definition, as that they do not produce carbon dioxide in their operation of producing energy. But a little bit more about the fact that we recognize that to build a cool energy system takes energy. And it turns out that this is minuscule compared with the energy they generate. I was listening to Dan Miller on his talk on Jevons paradox, and he has calculated that for each system installed, 500 more can be made and installed from the energy that that system produces. So we recognize that there's no such thing as a totally clean energy system, but the energy that takes to make them is far less than the energy they produce in their lifetime.
Would it be fair to say that we could have increasingly clean energy systems?
As you mean, as they take over other generation systems?
Yes.
That would be logical. Thanks, Jace. So I've listed here some of the obvious cool energy generators: solar panels, wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, tidal and sea wave generators, solar heat generators, nuclear fission, and a hope for the future is nuclear fusion. It doesn't exist today, but to leave it off the list, to me, it needs to be there as a possibility. What I've left off here, because it's arguable that it's a generation system, is, goodness, the word slipped my mind for a moment.
You mean like biomass?
No, I didn't mean biomass. I meant solar. I'll leave it for now. If I can't think of it, hopefully you won't either.
Yeah, and by the way, the other term for solar panels is photovoltaics. So if we use that, it's interchangeable with solar panels in this context. There are other kinds of solar generation as well, like focused beam solar generation, but we're not going to get into that really. We're just not going to go to that depth of specificity.
And the one I couldn't think of is fuel cells.
I am.
So here's a list of some, and the major ones, of fossil energy polluters. And the biggest and most disturbing is fossil generated electricity. Following that is fossil fuel transport. And then in no particular order, there's earth-moving equipment. It was important to me to put out war, because war, wherever it takes place in the manufacture of the bombs and moving people around in so many ways, it is a tragic polluter. Chemical and plastic production, ships, diesel rail transport, space rocketry, forest fires, and permafrost melt.
May I mention that all of these aren't necessarily a fixed product, that they can be modified to be made a lot less polluting.
And we'll cover that, actually.
Like chemical and plastic production, that's something that's very malleable. Okay, yes.
Yes.
Okay, maybe I'm jumping the shark here, so to speak.
We limited our solutions, that proposed solutions must be firstly technically feasible and available. And the only one up there that was not was nuclear fusion. Cost less to build than fossil, have low environmental impact, which is the same thing as minimally polluting, attractive to consumers, and sound enough to get buy-in from governments and industry. So we've left out some of the more esoteric solutions that we are not sure will happen in real life. And these are the candidates that we're going to go through in more detail. Reduce demand. And I've labeled that preemptive degrowth, because I think we're all aware that if all this fails, we may be into forced degrowth. So I've separated that from the concept of preemptive degrowth, trying to degrow in advance before we're forced to do so. And there is a groundswell that humanitarian needs and climate concerns are more important than accumulating stuff. I want to dwell on this for a moment. I've struggled with preemptive degrowth because I know it's a hard sell. But as I see that more and more of the world are actually picking up on the importance and rejecting accumulating more stuff, particularly young people, although I speak as an older person, and we have spent, when we moved to New Zealand 4.5 years ago, it was a wonderful opportunity to get rid of stuff. And we have been on that path ever since. But it is a very hard sell, and it is because commercial interests still hold sway. The advertising world makes it very hard. But that is no reason to stop us. I must continue to campaign for reduced energy consumption. But here's a reality. The increase in energy demand is inexorable. More than 1/3 of the global population is in poverty, and they have not contributed to the global warming, and they are the most vulnerable.
So, yeah, this is going to be one of our central points, and it is should be earmarked maybe through this presentation, is that the world is increasing its use of energy. It can be increasing the use of clean energy or fossil energy, dirty energy, polluting energy, but we both think that this demand for increased energy is inexorable, and that's a basis of our whole presentation.
I remember in Nepal, where doing peace workshops there, on more than one occasion, the issue of climate change came up. And I was told politely, but very strongly, that this was a first world problem, and we were the ones who had to fix it. Telling poor people to look after energy was not welcome in their country. New technology is hungry for energy. There are predictions that AI, artificial intelligence alone, will boost the American energy requirement by 70%. That's a huge number. I don't know whether it's real or not. I'm not even sure those who estimated know whether it's real, but it's certainly significant.
Yeah, that is a complex prediction, because we're getting into the world of quantum computers and other things which may modify that. And also you have to remember that the United States is the center of artificial intelligence for the world. So
that may change, but yes.
Yeah, that may change.
Perhaps they have the artificial intelligence, but not necessarily the real intelligence.
Exactly. We would wish that the U.S. would exhibit more innate or inherent intelligence.
And they're planning new deep drill geothermal generators to meet that AI demand. Again, we don't know whether that will happen, but
I understand that 2 of those are being installed as we speak.
Okay.
Those are the drilling techniques that have been. Are we going to cover this elsewhere in the presentation?
No, we're not. Go ahead.
So the new drilling techniques that came out of fracking can also be used to make geothermal almost anywhere in the world, but there are some better sites than others. Interesting, New Zealand has some great sites for this, but you can drill holes, and not only do you get the steam generation out of that, but you because you also get nice minerals that come up, rare earth minerals that come up and can be used as well. So it's quite an interesting industry, and I understand. I could be wrong, of course. I could be wrong on everything, but two of those are being made under massive data centers.
And I'm going to move on, but I noticed, Jace, that we're running slightly behind time, so
Are we?
probably should speed things up a little bit.
We're supposed to have here
I'm hoping that we can be finished in 45 minutes
5 minutes
for this
Okay.
to allow discussion. So, like it or not, the increase in demand for energy is really beyond our control. And industry will meet that demand. If there's money to be made, someone will step up to the task. This is an uncomfortable truth. The best we can do, I believe, is to meet that demand with cool energy. And the good news is, to a large extent, that is already happening. So moving on the so what we're preaching here is that there need to be more cool generators, and it is happening, and it is keeping pace with new demand. But it won't cut global warming unless fossil generation is eliminated. And this includes New Zealand, and you'll notice that.
Quick factoid. The amount of renewable energy installed in China in the last calendar year was more than the entire amount of renewable energy in the United States since the beginning of its, throughout mostly since the early 90s, installed in the United States. It's a remarkable amount of renewable energy. There is a ramp up in this. Whether we're going to survive this, we don't know, but there's hope. Here we go.
So the reason for it's hard is because existing fossil fuel power generators are profitable to run, including Taranaki Power Station, because the build costs are already paid. So it's going to take legislation and incentives to change this. And I'm not seeing that happen sufficiently anywhere in the world at this time. But eliminating fossil fuel generation is not an option. It is a requirement, and we'll be looking more at that as we go on. And one way of of it happening is reducing the clean energy cost so that it's no longer profitable because of competition to run these coal and oil stations. In fact, they're already low enough to eliminate fossil generation. It just hasn't happened yet. And true accounting must include the health benefits, the cost of storm damage, and the loss of life. But in fact, I'll let you speak to this.
Well, yeah, so I just want to make a real quick plug for the negative sides of our current transportation model and other things we do. And that is that our chemical pollution, which is basically burning of fossil fuels, has really remarkable public health detractions. And this was a new study from the New Zealand Ministry of Health that updated one that had been done, I think, 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, they made a set of calculations, which I had been using in my Your Future's Electric sort of rant, which, you know, because it was so dramatic that we were losing people every day. Well, and at that point, they estimated we were losing just about 3 people per day to the direct effects of our transportation model here. And now they've done a new assessment of that. It's a statistical assessment of our health system. And they say we're losing approximately 9-point-something people per day to the effects of fossil fuel burning, which basically is the nitrogen dioxide pollution quotient, which is from typically motor vehicles. But look at the statistics for this. Premature deaths, more than 3,300 adult New Zealanders die per year from exhaust fumes. More than 13,000 are hospitalized for respiratory and cardiac illnesses due to this. Asthma hospitalizations for children, 845. Cases of childhood asthma, 13,000, over 13,000. And approximately just under 2 million restricted activity days when people can't do the things they might otherwise do if air pollution had not been present. We are paying an enormous price for the transportation model and our economy as we're running it today. And if you were to look back at like the Aztecs with human sacrifices, where they were, sacrificing people to the gods so that they would have a good harvest, are we so much better because we know we can change this. We know that there is an alternative, and yet we are willing to sacrifice 9 people per day in New Zealand to maintain our standard of living as is, rather than transition over. I think it's a damning statistic. Thank you.
So even without such accounting, just based on the cost alone, they're low enough to eliminate fossil fuel. So there is no financial justification for ongoing fuel generation, and this should be low-hanging fruit. So the question is, how do we actually convince our government and the public of this? It's true, and if we believed it, how could we possibly carry on? There are other new technologies showing promise. One of them as building carbon dioxide capture systems, the one that's been most recently publicized because it's low cost and easily expandable, is seeding the mouths of rivers with limestone. And this is an advanced testing today. It's very low cost and it is scalable. And apparently it improves the biomass in the river itself. Well, it's a positive contribution, but is it enough is the question.
Well, certainly not by itself, but
Right.
but we probably are going to have a suite of solutions if we do indeed weather this part of our human experiment.
Yeah.
We're going to be a suite of things.
New technologies are being tested for reflecting of sun rays. Some of them, such as sulfur dioxide, are dangerous, but a country that's really losing a huge amount of deaths, such as India, may do something like this on its own behalf. It would affect the rest of the world. But if CO2 in the atmosphere continues to increase, then sun ray reflection is at best a very short-term solution.
And we didn't mention this name, but this typically comes under the category of geoengineering.
Yeah, thank you. And then plants lots of trees and greenery. Major efforts are underway in the Amazon basin. Planting trees is fantastic, especially for the long term. In the short term, perhaps it is not enough. But there is an elephant in the room we haven't covered yet.
Donald Trump?
And that is the petrol, diesel, liquid natural gas, aviation fuel, heavy fuel oil for ships, and heating oil that are burnt independently of electric generation. And these petrochemical products contribute most of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. Actually, it's over 90%.
And almost all of that public health degradation.
Yes, thank you. The primary market for these products is road and rail transport. This is for petrol. Gasoline's obviously just the American word here. Petrol's fine where we are. And battery-powered cars, electric cars, are the established alternative. But similar technologies are being deployed for trucks. Road transport contributes 15% of our carbon dioxide emission. The number for New Zealand is 18%. Eliminating much of the world's road transport emissions should be a low-hanging fruit. And we were doing it quite well in New Zealand. I'll get to that later, but it's meaningless if we recharge our cars from fossil fuel generators.
So are we launching into my section of the thing here?
No, I've interspersed some of your sections that just fit.
They just fit. Okay, well, but the point of this slide here is just to show you the maturity of the electric transportation model. It was running pretty well. The motors and all were running very well in the early 1900s. We just didn't have good batteries then. And there was never been a thing hiding us from having the technology of good batteries, but we spent our research money on other things than developing great batteries, and only now we're really developing it. And then we can indeed transition and live very well with ultra efficient new transportation models. We don't have to stop much of what we do today if we are smart about this, and if we do this at a very great pace. And that's key to what we're talking about.
I'll have a graph of that later. Okay. Going on to liquid natural gas, which has mostly come from fracking. The primary market for these products is stoves and hobs, home and mobile home heating generation, and power generation, which the closest local example is in Taranaki. Liquid gas is energy intensive to produce. The fracking process and the gas liquefaction both require energy, so that the energy for the whole process is worse than just the burning of that fuel into the atmosphere.
We didn't include the transportation of it, but that's a big factor in that.
True.
Yeah.
In many applications, electric power can replace liquid natural gas. And to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, the electric replacement power, this comes up on almost every example, must come from cool generation. Surprisingly, aviation fuel contributes only 2.5% of the global, 1 part in 25 of global dioxide emissions. The overall effect is a bit worse. It's 4% of global warming. And there is no short-term technology to replace it. Heavy fuel oil ship propulsion contributes about 3%. And harnessing wind to assist ship propulsion is under development and is economically viable. A lot of this development is taking place in Holland, and the potential saving is about 10%. And lastly on this list is heating oil. Liquid natural gas and heating oil are extensively used in cold climates. The USA is the largest use of heating oil, and Europe comes behind that. And they produce about 10% of the global carbon dioxide pollution. Cool electric power and tapping ground temperature are the best replacements. My niece at her house in Canada has done a marvelous job of digging a deep hole and putting in copper tubing and pumping water through that throughout the year. And it both cools and warms her house. And I've slept there, and it's marvelous. I want to cover Jevons paradox because every time I've had discussions on this recently, it's come up. So Jevons published a book in 1865 that analyzed the effect that coal-powered steam engines had on the coal market. Steam engine technology brought significant improvements in the efficiency of the use of coal. Logically, that might have required less coal for the same benefit. But what happened was that steam engines proliferated and other uses of coal were found, and a coal boom followed and continued for a century. There have been many examples since then. Blue LEDs, which is the basis of the white lamps that we have, is the technology behind them, and they are 7 times more efficient, so efficient that many of us have been much less careful about switching off the lights. I have another example. In my development of inkjet, we had this dream, those of us who were interested in those days on the technology, and we thought that by creating inkjet, it would avoid the overruns in printing that were taking place on large printing presses. What actually happened was the convenience of having a printer in your home office or at work resulted in a 6-fold increase in the use of printing paper. So these things are not always obvious. We thought we were doing something great on the climate and waste issue, and we had miscalculated totally.
I might add onto this is that you can find quite a few things that you could attribute to the Jevons paradox, but I think that there are lots of advantages. Maybe the next slide actually shows that. You can find, next slide, I think.
Okay. So in this example, how will Jevons paradox affect, of course, the proliferation of cool energy sources such as solar panels? If you do know that the panels on your roof, and I know people on this call who have such, are producing power that will go to waste if you don't use it, will you switch off your air conditioner or leave it on? Well, if the weather is uncomfortable, I might well leave it on. So the question is, would leaving it on produce carbon dioxide and increase global warming? And the answer is no. So is Jevons paradox a negative for what we're doing? It's an interesting question.
So I guess we're shifting from that. I think there are lots of other examples where Jevons paradox falls short, where efficiency actually does mean that we just end up using less energy. But so we're going to go into an argument why electricity is so incredibly valuable, but why it is the premier type of energy that we could ever produce. And amazingly, it's quite available to us in New Zealand and other places as well. So a lot of the big ships of the world now are actually electrically driven. They often will have diesel generators that are running at a constant RPM and a constant carburation, and they might have 6 or 8 generators, but the actual thing that turns the shaft and the propeller is an electric drive. So this is an example of a ship like that, and we're going to go on to show you some other examples. We know diesel electric trains. Next slide.
Okay, well, you can press that button.
Oh, diesel electric trains are, a prime example of that. Here is a coal train. The actual motive power that is running the wheels, typically on modern trains of all sorts, is electricity. And the reason is, and I'm going to show you with the next slide, the reason is, the reason is that electricity has the wonderful capacity of having all of its torque from the very first RPM. So it's 100% torque from 0 RPM. You can imagine this with a battery drill. If you want to drive a screw with a battery drill, it will just punch that screw right through. You don't have to, rev it up or have a clutch and engage it or anything like you do with a gas-driven car or other appliance. It is amazing capacity, and I wouldn't bother looking at this graph other than to say the difference between electric motors and gasoline motors or petrol-driven motors is remarkably different in that the power is available as you take off. And anyone who's had an electric car, what was your...
we had a Prius, and the acceleration on that thing was amazing. It blew us away.
I have an electric van, and it is just, you can start on a hill and you will not notice that you are starting on a steep hill.
And my two brothers who have Teslas and are much richer than I am, I've driven that thing. It's actually scary if you put your foot down.
Yeah, the torque is very, very, very available, and this makes it incredibly useful for industrial processing and for transportation. The reason that we find that we want to go to these more efficient cars is basically that the degree of electricity that you can use. So this shows you this graph, and you'll see the efficiency is all the way over to the right where it's totally EV, and it tapers off to the left, which is the regular internal combustion engine, ICE. And the degree at which you find the efficiency is basically the degree at which it's powered by electricity. So when you have a hybrid vehicle or a PHEV, which is what they often call a strong hybrid, the degree of the efficiency is basically the degree at which that vehicle is using electricity. And now that we have very much better batteries, we really have almost no reason not to have totally electric cars. And you can see the efficiency level of a battery-only car is just over 4 times better than the efficiency of a gas-driven car if you take into all of its sort of wheel-to-wheel efficiencies in play. And I'm going to go into why in New Zealand we have every incentive to do that. So just as a basic thing, if you're talking about an internal combustion engine on the left, you're looking at hundreds of moving parts, lots and lots of friction. You're looking at a low torque level, which we talked about with the torque of electric vehicles. And then on the right, you see the electric car or any electric vehicle. And it really just has the stator in the vehicle is the one thing that actually spins. And it makes it ever so much simpler, so much less maintenance, but also about 4.2 times more efficient. And that efficiency has to be calculated when we're talking about the transition to a zero emission transportation model. You have to think that you're also gaining that incredible efficiency. So in New Zealand, these are all graphs, by the way, from our government. These are all derived from our government, and a couple of them from international data sources. But we've had this ramp up of electric vehicles, which has been typical, slow, not as dramatic as it has been in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and other places, and even the US. And then you'll see in 2024, we've tapered off and we're growing, but growing a lot less well. And that is because we've removed the incentive program for these things. And typically, to get a graph going up into an exponential function, it really, really helps to have an incentive at the first of it. And the reason we would want that, of course, is because of all those public health benefits, because we're generating our electricity at home, and because it's less expensive to run those vehicles anyway. So we're transitioning. Are we transitioning fast enough? I would argue no, but we are making that effort. Even so, you hear the argument, well, aren't we just going to tax the grid? Well, the interesting thing is, one is that at least currently, we have very few electric cars in New Zealand, and we aren't even close to making an increased tax on the grid. And I really won't go into that more because I have other things to say that are more important, I think.
Yeah, we're tight on time.
Are we tight on time? So, in terms of energy self-sufficiency, which is something we should care about. We actually are going downhill with this, which is really strange in a country that has all the natural resources that we have. We can make this turn, and we're on the upswing now. But we have every incentive and possibility to bring this up to a very, very high number, as are other countries, other advanced countries. Just shows you the total energy inputs that we're putting on. We're still increasing our annual consumption for transport and industrial uses, and other ones are more modestly increasing. But you know, there's room to really move on all these statistics. This is quite interesting to me. So because of the use of heat pumps, and to a lesser extent the other efficiency appliances like microwaves and things like that, the average per capita usage of electricity in New Zealand has actually come down quite a bit. Now, with the advent of electric vehicles, that's likely to go up again, but the power companies are actually looking for customers to use more ways of using electricity, because our capacity is a bit greater than we have now, and other countries are finding the same thing. And I don't know if we're going to get into that very much, other than I'm going to make an argument that we actually have every possibility to meet the increased demands that we are going to be met, both here and abroad. Just to give a little overview of how incredibly different the efficiencies are between the different sources of energy, like wind and solar and hydroelectricity, and you see that the efficiencies are just so much different. Everything else rates against them because they're so much better than every other source for efficiencies. So you can see the prices of photovoltaic solar panels, and everybody knows that those have been plummeting especially since 2000. You can see since 2010 that's been increasing, and that downward trend in pricing has increased even this year. It's balanced out a little bit in the last couple of years, but now it's coming down again with the advent of some new technology in that field, and that is going to increase. We do believe, but even now we have to understand that this is cheaper to install solar panels as a primary source of electricity on the grid than it is to even continue to buy coal. Coal itself, even in existing power plants, is more expensive than converting those power plants, because they have the grids already connected in that place for that distribution, to convert that to electric, like photovoltaics and wind, is already an argument now that we can make, and that's being done, by the way. There are many coal plants that are just using the area that they're on to convert to photovoltaics, and using that grid connection to tie into the larger grid.
I heard recently from a visitor to China who learned that where he was there, that the cost of a solar panel on the roof was lower than the cost of putting plywood in there.
That's an amazing statistic. And also, there's many places in the world now that in the middle of the day, the solar potential to generate electricity is greater than demand, and so they actually do not use the power that they're producing. That's happening in Australia. It's happening in other places with wind generation as well. And so we're seeing this transition. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that later. And energy intensity. So this graph is just interesting. So if you look at the GDP of New Zealand, and you look at the energy usage to create that is a beneficial graph going down with the efficiency of our industry, lighting, and other sources of things, transportation even, to a certain extent. We are now seeing the efficiency per unit of GDP going down. So we're on the right track in some measure there. Just to show you some of the sources of generation that we are uniquely gifted here in New Zealand, the MBIE, the ministry, the government suggests that we could generate 3 times more capacity in geothermal. Next slide. We have twice the average production in our wind generation as EU turbines. An interesting side note, oftentimes now we are removing old turbines even before they are finished their life cycle, because the newer models are so much more efficient. You just install a newer one on the same site and you can get a much better bang for buck in terms of that generation. Everybody knows that the weak link in renewable energy is the energy storage. This is a battery from one of my old bicycles. But that's coming online at a really great clip. And we are now seeing grid scale energy storage that is going to, and the next year or two, we're going to start seeing that making renewable energy 24/7 kind of an energy because of iron oxide batteries, a couple other technologies that are coming on board. But we here in the Nelson region have the best battery that could ever be. I argue, this is my idea, that the Cobb Dam could be an amazing battery. So the Cobb Dam makes a head of water, which is 600 meters above the Pelton wheels that are down at the bottom where the generation center is. And that's an enormous pressure difference. Now, right now, they run them 24/7, and that generation is, good. But my argument is, with all the renewable energy we have here, potential of solar and wind, which we should be installing, and we're not maybe to the capacity we need to, we can then turn off the hydroelectricity at Cobb Dam during the peak, during the daytime hours and nighttime hours when we have low generation, and only turn it on when we have the peak demand, which is typically kind of breakfast and dinner. And that's why we can remove peaker plants out of our equation. And so that's my great argument, that peaker plants are this can be a big battery. Here's an example where I think Jevons paradox really breaks down in terms of the efficiency of bus travel, electric bicycle, making cities walkable and bikeable. It's incredibly scalable, and we should be so lucky that those things would scale up the way they have done in other cities. And I just want to make this further argument for the electrification of New Zealand is that our oil importation here is almost exactly in lockstep to our foreign debt. So we spend just under $8 billion a year to buy oil into our economy here, burning it, of course, to our public health detriment. But we buy this oil from the Middle East, generally, most of it, almost all of it, and 70% of those countries are not even democratic. We abhor the way they treat minorities, women, and yet we pay them almost $8 billion a year for the importation of oil, shipping it halfway across the world, and then burning it at about 19 to 20% efficiency in our automobiles. It's a remarkably bad deal. We can bring that energy generation home and avoid a lot of this foreign balance of payments problem, create jobs here in New Zealand. It's a win-win-win, I believe, for us here in New Zealand. And yet, we have yet another reason to be concerned about this. We are in the firing line for the negative aspects of global warming. And so for all of those reasons, we have an incentive to convert to renewable energy. I think enough of that said. I won't go into that. We all know from recent experience how bad that can be. Our kids can have an energy intensive future if we train them now. We bring that payment, that investment back to New Zealand. We exploit the parts of renewable energy we have here, and it will create new jobs for them. And we just don't give them a sports education. We can give them a very good lease on life with great jobs in the energy sector. Is that the end of my little portion of this?
One more.
And I wanted to point out that if we think we can't make this transition in some sort of timely manner, I want you all to think back about when smoking was permitted on airplanes. It seems ridiculous now, and it is ridiculous, but that's the way that burning fossil fuels in the open atmosphere in our cities. Imagine that we are driving by schools emitting cancer-causing fumes to be spread through the classrooms on every day that those schools are in session. It's amazing. We're going to look back on this and we're going to say, I can't believe we are burning fossil fuels in the open atmosphere because it's as stupid as having smoking on airplanes.
Sorry, it's doing some repeats here, so I'm jumping ahead. Didn't realize I had these repeats in here. Okay, so I'm looking at priorities here. And these are my priorities. If you have different ones, then great. And the first of those is to eliminate fossil fuel power generation. It is the largest polluter, and electric power is the basis of many of our other suggested savings. So if we don't get rid of it, the other methods don't work. It makes sense financially, and it's a low-hanging fruit. Electrifying road transport, similarly, it's the biggest bang for the buck. It's already underway, and it's a low-hanging fruit. And I'm just reminding you of that graph we looked at with Jace earlier, where we had the incentives and they're no longer in place, and look at the difference it makes. And my third priority is to plant trees. Once we've stopped carbon dioxide emission, we still have to get it out of the atmosphere. And the best way to undo the damage we've done, and it's a long-term solution. Priorities for Aotearoa is to, in my view, to eliminate natural gas electricity generation in Taranaki by replacing it with cool energy. The Taranaki natural gas source is dwindling, and the government has authorized gas importation. The power bidding system in New Zealand effectively allows the Taranaki generator to set the price of power to the benefit of all New Zealand power generators, mostly government-owned. This was very well explained by David Keats' lecture last week, part of the Fabian Society lecture. And he pointed out that a 3 times lower price for power would be possible if we no longer had the Taranaki power station setting the price. And the benefits would clearly be the public, but also Aotearoa as a whole, because it will attract industrial users such as artificial intelligence and aluminium refineries, and even the government, because the taxes on new industries will pay much more than the loss of dividends because they own part of our power stations. And the world, because less carbon dioxide, it will be less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And interestingly, low-cost cool energy generation is a way Aotearoa can actually export power. We can't set up power lines to the rest of the world, but by bringing industries onshore that consume cool energy, we are in effect exporting that cool energy.
Have we made that point about the bauxite mining being that an example of that, just if that's not clear, if, for instance, we have such a available hydroelectric scheme in the south part of the South Island that we actually import bauxite to refine it into aluminum just because that energy center is there. And that's what's going to happen, as it always has happened in economies, is industry moves towards the production of energy. You know, it used to be that mills would go where the hydroelectric, you know, dams could power the mills. Well, we're going to have industry moving to areas that have available solar, photovoltaics, wind, and other sources of renewable energy. It will always happen that way and that's what's happening could happen with AI as well, which was John's point. We could be exporting that as well.
You know, they're drilling holes down kilometers deep in order to source geothermal energy in the States at the moment, and they don't have to dig very deep. In New Zealand, I've scalded my foot in some of the pools. But the second priority that I want to bring up is restoring the incentives for buying electric vehicles. We've already looked at this. And that we would also make sure, of course, that there are sufficient recharging stations throughout Aotearoa. And I've lost the ability to advance here. Let me just try and get it back. I'm just going back there now.
Are you back?
I will be in a moment.
If not, I can go on with something else.
No, we're really at the end. So now we're back. So we've covered that. So the question of our statement at the start was, there is a clean energy future? I don't think we've proved that, and I don't think anyone can. What we have done is shown what can be and must be done both globally and here in New Zealand. Low-hanging fruit goes to rot if it isn't picked. There is good reason to hope. I want to point out that our individual contributions are great examples, but they're actually not enough. We must work together to convince our friends, our community, and our government of what to change and what to do to ensure that we have a clean energy future. And this is the last slide. Be prepared to be surprised. Change happens exponentially. A great number of concerned and bright minds are dedicated to a cool, clean energy future. Any number of surprising technologies are maturing in the near future that can turn our world around. We can't guarantee it, but there is hope yet for planet Earth. Thank you.
And I had a couple of add-on points, but we might go to questions, and they might come up in questions if anybody has them. What do you say about that?
I have a good idea. I'm going to close the slide so I can see the questions.
Thank you very much for that hopeful message, and for your lovely interactive mode of delivery. Okay, so we are now open for questions, and perhaps you might turn your video on, those who have it off for power saving reasons, so that I can see if you raise your hand or are showing the hand raising icon. And while you're formulating your questions, perhaps I can get one in, and that is, Jace and John, could you have indicated the next areas that we should move into, but could you perhaps be specific about if you could persuade people to take action? What are the 3 next helpful things that people could do about this?
Well, Can I answer that?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, I think John and I are not going to start talking about home generation systems so much, even though I think program, because even that should be a national program. I think all of our suggestions have to do with policy initiatives. They have to do with countrywide initiatives that would transition in a way which is commiserate with the problem that we face, because we are in a real pickle here. We've waited till the 11th hour to make this transition. So I don't think we're going to start making individual things. It's not really a matter anymore of composting better. We need to have a societal makeover if we are going to have this happen at all. Even if we do that, John and I are only mildly optimistic, I think it's fair to say, that this is possible. But it's going to take that kind of a, the moonshot initiative, as they used to say. It's going to take a real nationwide effort to achieve that.
I'd like to tell you a story. I was flying in the US about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was upgraded. I was a frequent flyer, so that occasionally happened. And I ended up sitting next to a man who was a consultant to the oil industry. And there were many interesting things in that conversation, but one of them was his statement that the oil industry recognizes the value of encouraging individual action, because they realize that individual action will take the focus against action at government level. And I'm not in any way saying by this that we shouldn't be doing individual action. But if it takes away our focus from the need to speak to the nation, the public in general, our government, then the oil industry is won out.
Yeah, we have much more to gain by combined action than by individual action, and it's going to require that.
And we did give priorities, which was around this line in the last few slides. One of them was the strong need, which is economically justified, to close down fossil energy power generation. The second was the need to push for electrification of road transport. Thanks,
So
Julia.
yes, you're very clear that it's systemic action that's needed, and those two matters are the areas on which you'd particularly encourage advocacy by people and groups. Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay. Are there some other questions that people, or comments that people would like to put to John and Jace? Leslie.
You're on mute, Leslie.
Okay. A while ago, maybe a year or two ago now, I listened to a webinar. Sorry, can't remember who was doing the talking. And the statement was made very clearly that alternative energy sources, like we're talking about here tonight, cannot replace fossil fuel-based energy. There isn't the same intensity of energy. So maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, I would. Yes, in general, the things like windmills and solar cells, even a large solar farm, are not as powerful as some fossil fuel energy generators, but they have the advantage that they are distributed in different places. So the grid can easily manage the multiple distribution of those energies. The US, which at the moment has gone from 100% fossil energy to 40% clean energy and 40% and 60% fossil fuel still, is a big example of this. The proliferation there is going gangbusters, I think is the technical term. And and I see no concern about. So you're replacing some big generators by some smaller ones, and I can't see a downside to that.
So I have a very important point about this, Leslie. This is one of the things I wanted to add to this discussion. And that is that I've also listened to those statements. They're based upon studies done about the BTU value of petrochemicals. They'll say, you know, aviation fuel or petrol has a certain amount of energy inherent in it, which is vast. It's a very great battery. And they'll say, so we have to convert over. And that was done. There was two major studies done, one by a Spanish group and such. And that's been used extensively by people like Nate Hagen and others to say that we have to replace the BTU value of petrochemicals with the electrical generation and renewables. And actually, the thing that we've been trying to present to you throughout this whole thing is that that is not actually the equation. What we have to replace is the ability to transport people, the ability to provide comfort, the ability to make things and do the services of a modern society, not the actual BTU value of the fuel, because we waste about 80% of the BTU value of petrochemicals when we're using it. Like cars have about 20% efficiency. So when we replace those with a vehicle that has 4.5 times or 4.2 times better efficiency, we're doing the same convenience with far less energy. And that is that's actually the equation that is the one that we have to hurdle. So the hurdle that we have to jump is a lot lower than many would have us believe, who would make this simple calculation that is just the heat value of petrochemicals, which is great. It is great, but we're all already finding the flaws in that. So that's the one point that is really important to get home, is that the equation has been misrepresented by some people who maybe have a reason to misrepresent that. It is quite a bit more accessible, even though it's going to be difficult. It's quite a bit more accessible than some would have us believe.
The one case where it is true, and the reason that we don't have a solution at the moment, is in aviation fuel, because planes have a limited capacity to what they can carry, and they can't carry heavy batteries. So that is why we haven't got a short-term solution for flying. But that's the only case that I know of.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The short-term solution for aviation is not there. But I make this point that a lot of the things that we now take for granted were naysayed by people just a few years ago. For instance, we had people that doubting the possibility of electric buses or electric trucks. They were thought impossible until, my goodness, they're here in the cheapest form of transportation. A lot of people thought that that recyclable and reusable wind turbine blades couldn't be made until, oh my goodness, they're here, completely 100% recyclable. A lot of people said that recycling solar panels wasn't going to happen until now they are all recycled, essentially. A lot of people said that video conferencing wouldn't happen, that offshore wind turbines weren't a possibility, that heat pumps and microwave ovens, foiling sailboats, space rockets landing on their launch pads. A lot of individuals look at today's current available technology, and they assume that that is the extent of what's going to happen tomorrow. But we are breaking those barriers every day, and there's so much in the pipeline about better batteries that are going to have in aviation. There are now solid-state batteries that are looking like they're going to be great for aviation. They're starting to be produced, lo and behold, this year. So things are actually in a very great state of flux. So anytime you hear someone who's making a summation that we can't get there from here, they are really, I would have to say, in a polite way, they're misinformed, but in a less polite way, I would say that they can't see the nature of change. The nature of change is not only happening, it's accelerating. if change happens exponentially.
There's a third point, that they may be well informed, but they're being paid by the oil industry.
Yeah, there are those people out there indeed.
Mm.
There's lots of think tanks and people who are paid to produce materials that will distract us from this need to remove ourselves from petrochemicals. That's a sad thing, but there were more lobbyists at the World Conference on Climate than there were delegates.
Next question.
Muriel has a question. Do you want to voice it, Muriel, or shall I read it? Okay. How do we get this government and the general public to take notice and act on your recommendations?
Well, my best hope at the moment is to vote them out at the next election. Because I'm not sure I know the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's not within what we're presenting tonight. And I would say, let's go on with other questions. It's just, that's not what we're about here.
We don't have an answer.
Yeah,
But Muriel likes your answer.
yeah.
Okay. Jack has a question or a comment.
Nice to see you, Jack.
Yeah. Hi there. Yep, I'm here. Yeah, thanks. The points you're making are really important, and I agree with almost all of them. There's no question we have to move away from fossil fuel. There's no question that electric power is incredibly more efficient and relatively cleaner. The question I would have for you is, as I'm sure you're aware, that climate change is one symptom of a more fundamental issue of ecological overshoot.
Mm.
And one of the concerns that always comes up about renewables, or what you're calling cool energy, is that it allows for a continuation of the business as usual paradigm that has generated ecological overshoot.
Mm.
The data that I'm familiar with suggests that climate change or greenhouse gas emissions accounts for about 60% of overshoot. So even if we got rid of fossil fuels, which we obviously need to do urgently, we're still left with 40% being an overshoot. How do you guys see the relationship between electrification of everything and dealing with the fundamental issue of ecological overshoot?
I'd
How
like
do you
to,
see
I'd like
that
to pick
balancing?
one up if I can. Jack, I've heard you speak on this, and I agree with you. I think that Jace and I had a bit of a discussion right at the very beginning of writing this, and we, since our title, which we'd already signed up to, that was clean energy future, we decided to focus on the energy side and steered clear of the point that you're making. My first book that I read that brought this out so clearly was by a Quaker in Sydney, who's since died, and he really put this point very strongly. I think that the climate emergency and the potential loss of biodiversity and the loss of life that will come if we don't deal with energy, for me, is a priority. That does not mean that producing more stuff and the poisoning of the planet isn't almost equally important to me. It actually is. So I'm reluctantly, no, not reluctantly, I think the biodiversity, I think the whole issue of poisoning the planet is almost as important. And maybe we need another webinar on that. I'm not necessarily the person to lead it, but I am strongly supportive that needs to be dealt with. I think I'm still comfortable with the focus we made today, and the fact that we left this out, but it's there for
Well,
me.
I don't think we left it out completely, John.
Mm.
For instance, I mentioned that I thought the world's best battery was Cobb Lake. So we can rejigger our energy sort of profile around here and do much, much better than we can now. For instance, we have every incentive to have a local grid scale PV system here. We lose 10% of the energy that comes across on the grid from Hanmer. So if we pay a 10% penalty on this grid power that comes into us, so if whatever we produce locally, we have that as a bonus. Then we have the availability, if there's an earthquake or there's a redundancy needed for some other natural disaster, we also have that backup that we have our local generation. We have Cobb Lake that could bump us through the peak power times of morning and evening. So we have, I believe, one of the most beneficial possibilities to make this transition. I do not think we're talking about the kind of massive revamping of our things like new distribution lines and things like that. I don't think we're talking about that so much. We have every incentive to do this, and we may not make it through. Even if we do everything, we may not make it through.
I'm not sure that answers Jack's question.
Yeah.
To me, his question is that whatever energy is created and however it's done, it produces more. It produces more available power to make stuff, and making stuff, and the stuff itself is part of the poisoning of the planet.
I think he was talking about the transition and the energy required to make the transition. Which one was that, Jack? Was it the required energy?
No, it's not just a net energy issue. It's closer to what John has mentioned, but I'll just clarify it even a bit more. I think it's a fact that the more energy we use, regardless of its source, the more impact we have on the natural systems, and the more that we potentially disrupt natural systems. So your one of your opening comments about the inexorable demand for increased energy is something we have to accept, is something I would challenge and suggest that while we need the transition that you're talking about, we also, even more urgently, I think, or simultaneously, require to challenge that inexorable demand and increase of energy, and find ways of using the more efficient electrical systems that you're talking about to focus on the things that really need doing with energy to make life worthwhile. Because I believe that that's where the direction that gives us an even greater chance of making kind of transition that we can live well sustainably. Because I also have my doubts that even doing that with a 25% increase in population.
Jack, let me answer your question, because you're rambling a little bit on that.
That's not right.
It's when we transition to a renewable energy system, we actually relieve the ecological burden that we're putting on the world by using fossil fuels. So
That's
to the
true.
degree at which we make a clean energy future, we are actually protecting the biological heritage that we have now. I think John and I are saying we need an institutional way of doing that transition so that we actually avoid the worst parts of the energy debacle that we're in right now, which is that we're creating broad public health problems, broad ecological problems. Transporting energy from halfway around the world. What a stupid kind of energy profile we have. And because we accept that people are going to need comfort and conveniences, and we're not going to remove those from them, and none of us would accept that really, then we need to do that in an improved way. And those ways are available. We just need to institute them on a broad basis. And we may be able to do that. And that's our point. There is hope in that regard.
I'd like to speak sort of in between here briefly, because I think our time's up. Yes, part of the poisoning of the earth is the way we're doing it now. But there are others, as you point out, Jack, when you have energy, there you can find different ways to poison the earth. And there is a balance between the two. And no, I'll just stop there.
I think one of the
Okay.
big points that we've been trying to make is that the term energy is not an omnibus term. And so whenever you hear anyone say, energy is one thing, that is just really a misnomer. Jack's shaking his head. He doesn't believe that.
No, I agree. No, I agree with that.
Okay, yeah, very good.
Yeah,
So
many different kinds of energy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So that's one of the big points we wanted to make is it's a much more nuanced equation and a much more beneficial equation, especially for us here in New Zealand. And that is one of our major points that we wanted to get across. Is that fair to say, John?
No, I agree with you, but I want to also hear Jack's point.
I think he was just agreeing with us.
Good.
Well, no, I'm agreeing that the different forms of energy have incredibly different consequences environmentally and socially. We agree on that. Where I think there's still a question is whether the kind of energy transition you're talking about, not in terms of the transition from fossil fuels to electricity. I totally agree with that. I mean, we've been living off grid for 17 years and enjoy it enormously. The point I'm trying to make is that we have to give consideration to the total amount of energy we use, even if it's all electric, and what we're using that energy for, and whether it's really necessary for human happiness and well-being, because the more we use, the more ecosystem disruption we do. It's that simple an equation.
It is not that simple equation, Jack. It's a much more nuanced equation. It is much
I
more
disagree
nuanced.
with that.
Okay.
We'll leave it there.
For instance, when we
Yeah.
transition from our diesel bus fleet in Nelson to an electric bus fleet, and now we have an electric bus fleet, is there now a problem with the fumes being given off by the electric bus?
No, Jace, you're missing, the point I'm trying to make is it's the total amount of energy, even if it's all electric, can still be a problem in terms of disrupting ecological systems. That's the simple point I'm trying to make. And that we have to look
I
at.
would argue, Jack, it's not that simple. And we've argued right
Okay.
here. It's not that simple.
We
It's a
we
much
will
more
leave
nuanced
it there at this point. The issue is a very important one. I think that the two of you have established very clearly the enormous merits of a transition to renewable energy. The issue of the impact of the total use of energy on the biosphere and the human demand for energy remains an open and unresolved one, which we will leave here for tonight. It's interesting, important, and we all have useful things to say on that. But you have been extremely effective in demonstrating the importance of a rapid transition to renewable energy. And we thank you both very much for a very interesting presentation. And again, I particularly enjoyed how interactive it was. And I will close now with a karakia, which has to do with, we've been out on the ocean, we've reached the shore, we're looking around at each other, and trying to move together in the same direction. Ko te hā, ko te pō, ko tangaroa, ko te mana, ko te kotahitanga o ngā mātāwaka. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Thank you all for attending and sleep well.